Good morning to you and a warm welcome to Spotlight. And on Spotlight, we usually focus on current affairs related concerns. So today we will be touching on looting and illegal trafficking of cultural properties. And to do the honors, we have with us two personalities who will be conducting this interesting discussion. So to do the honors, I invite Dr. Repatriating, and he is a senior lecturer at the University of Ruhuna, and together with him, Dr. Emmeline Smith, criminologist, will be joining in. She is a university lecturer at the University of Glasgow. Over now to Dr. Bohingamua.
Thank you, Sharifa. Today we are going to talk about the looting, illegal trafficking of cultural properties. Now it doesn't sound nice to talk about looting and illegal trafficking of cultural properties, but it happens. It happens in Asia, in Africa, in many other places, also right here in Sri Lanka. It happens across the international waters and borders. The cultural properties reach international auctions, museums, and private collections. This is despite the fact that it is an international crime. The United Nations has identified cultural property as vital part of common cultural heritage of humankind and a unique testimony of cultural evolution of man. The UN has also established several international instruments to protect cultural property. However, plundering of heritage sites and museums and illegal trafficking of cultural properties continue, because there is a huge demand and a high price for cultural objects in international markets in Europe and Northern America. For example, a moonstone advertised as a genuine Anuradhapura period Sandakada Pahana by Bonham auction in London in 2013 was sold for over 110 million Sri Lankan rupees, even after it was clearly identified as a counterfeit. The identification was done by myself. Looting and trafficking of cultural properties results in the loss, destruction, and removal of unique archaeological and historical value. Ayubowan and welcome to Spotlight. I am Repatriating Bohingamua to discuss a range of matters related to trafficking and of cultural properties. I have the pleasure of having Dr. Emmeline Smith, a lecturer in criminology from the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Emmeline is widely experienced in researching and dealing with cultural properties, trafficking across the borders, also working with and lecturing across a number of international institutions in Europe and Asia. More importantly, her research mainly focuses Asia, number of Asian countries including Sri Lanka. She is interested in how and why participants take part in illegal transnational trade and how the so-called global cities facilitate such trade. Emmeline is right here in Sri Lanka and in fact concluding her field work. Also she had a workshop today at the Department of Archaeology in Sri Lanka. So why not we grab this opportunity to talk to Emmeline. Emmeline, Ayubowan and welcome again to Sri Lanka and to this program. I really hope you had nice time and fruitful field work in Sri Lanka, and so let's have a chat on this very important and interesting topic today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Emmeline, now to start this conversation, let me begin by asking a couple of very simple questions to clarify a few things to our viewers. Can you simply explain what is this illicit trade of cultural property, and also why and how we should protect these cultural properties?
Great question. Okay, so the illicit trade in cultural objects is trade that goes against local legislation. So a country will have said that its cultural heritage is important enough to be protected by local laws. And when trade of those cultural objects or when export or import of those objects happens against local laws, we speak of illicit trade. Now, this is a global illicit trade, which means that almost every country in the world is implicated and involved in such trade, whether it is by supplying archaeological material, cultural objects, or whether it is by transiting or buying such objects.
Right, which means like, there are local as well as international laws binding these cultural properties. There
are local laws, absolutely, and there are international agreements. So there is international agreements and bilateral agreements where countries have made an agreement with each other to protect collaboratively these cultural objects in both countries, yes.
Emily, then the next question, the obvious question would be, what are these legal frameworks that are put in place to combat illegal trafficking of cultural properties at international level?
There are two main conventions. The 1970 UNESCO Convention and the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention are often mentioned as the main legislative frameworks and international agreements for this topic. And you asked previously, why do cultural objects need to be protected? It's because we recognize that they are scientifically, historically, culturally valuable. So they're not just commodities. In fact, they are invaluable objects. However, of course, some people have put a price on them.
Yeah, later on in this program, we will talk about how people create identities based on these cultural objects. At the same time, now there are legal frameworks put in place. At the same time, are there sufficient attempts made to enlighten people about the importance of these cultural properties at global and local levels? Are you happy about how Sri Lanka has been dealing with these cultural properties and efforts taken by Sri Lanka to enlighten people about the significance of these cultural properties?
I think civil society plays an essential role in the protection of cultural heritage. Whatever legal framework is put in place, it won't work unless it's enforced and unless it has the support of the local communities that use these cultural objects every day. Of course, lots has been done in archaeologically rich countries like Sri Lanka, and these international agreements especially in the beginning, placed a lot of the pressure, the burden of protection on archaeologically rich countries. Market nations, like for example, those in Europe or North America, and now also increasingly China, Vietnam, Japan, they have been less proactive in putting in place measures not only to protect their own cultural heritage, but also to counter illicit trade and to proactively address the problematic nature of some of those cultural objects that cross into their borders.
Don't you think the plundering of cultural sites and museums and illegal trafficking of cultural objects are demand-driven? And there is a well-organized underground network operating at local, regional and global level. Because the final destination of these artifacts are the international auctions and museums and private collections in big cities that are situated far away from where they are looted. How does this traffic happen when there are legal framework in place at local and global level to prevent that happens? Any thoughts about it?
The demand is simply too strong, and this is where demand countries in North America, in Europe, but also new market countries like China, Japan and Vietnam should be responsible and should be more proactive in finding solutions to counter illicit trafficking. Of course, Sri Lanka can also play its part by protecting its heritage within its borders. It has a fantastic 1956 antiquities ordinance in place. It has strong law enforcement, strong customs, and at the same time this still happens because demand is simply too strong, because there are no sustainable alternative livelihoods in place, And I think also, especially in Sri Lanka, because civil society can do more in protecting on the one hand, and on the other hand in market nations in demanding from museums, from private collectors, from auction houses, that there is accountability for their role in the global illicit trade in cultural objects, so that ultimately we don't walk around in tourist sites, in World Heritage sites, in museums with a lot of beheaded Buddhas, for example, or with statues with missing limbs. That has become so normalized, whereas in fact we should be asking, how did these objects come here? Why are they here? And why are they not in their country of origin?
Is it also a matter of sort of awareness, and on part of those responsible, they haven't been able to enlighten the people with regards to such racketeers, the dealers in cultural heritage. I feel sometimes that we have not been able to enlighten the people sufficiently to sort of prevent such crimes taking place.
Public awareness, of course, plays a huge part in that. Absolutely, yes.
Right. As I mentioned earlier, stealing and illegal trafficking of cultural properties to a certain extent is demand driven. Many laws, at least at local level, seems to be aimed at punishing looters, not big buyers and auctioneers. Are there sufficient measures to punish buyers and auctioneers? The International Council on Museums, for example, has laid down clear guidelines for not buying or even exchanging artifacts of which the provenance is unclear. What is your views on this?
Absolutely. We should increase legislation more, make it more holistic, so that there are less loopholes which offenders, especially transnational offenders, can make use of in this area. And at the same time, institutions that are already holders of cultural objects should be more proactive in order to address the problematic narratives that surround these objects, because ultimately it's about access and agency. It's about the power that these institutions hold over the cultural objects, which may or may not be illegal, but is certainly often unethical. And so in these cases, we should, when I say we, I mean European, North American institutions, should listen much more to archaeologically rich nations that have lost their cultural heritage in order to be guided by what they actually want. And if that is just acknowledgement that those objects are, for example, from Sri Lanka, that they can be kept in the museums that they are in now or in the collections that they are in now, but that at least ownership should be established, or perhaps that should be repatriation or some form of other collaborative agreement. But it is all about reinstating that access and agency which has been taken away in the past, whether it is through looting, trafficking, through colonial looting, for example. But that kind of trade and trafficking is still ongoing, as you say, because of the demand for this. That is never fading.
Emily, let me bring your attention to the Asia, because your focus has been Asia, and now you are concluding your field work in Sri Lanka. In one of your papers that you wrote with some of your colleagues, you have discussed how trafficking of cultural properties now take place within and across Asia. This is, of course, in addition to their trafficking to Western markets. Can you elaborate on this fact, and also tell us how Sri Lanka is linked to this Asian trafficking of cultural properties?
It's a good question. I think a lot more buying power is present in Asia at the moment because of these new developing markets. Particularly when we look at China, for example, China has a huge buying power when it comes to Buddhist cultural heritage, of which Sri Lanka obviously has a lot. Sri Lanka, because of its location, has always been a transit point and has therefore been a very convenient point for looting and trafficking not only in colonial times, but also in more recent times. So because of this demand shifting, perhaps, from Europe and North America now towards new buying countries in Asia, the looting and trafficking of cultural objects has never really stopped. And because of the rich artistic heritage that is present in Sri Lanka, the fact that all of these objects are so incredibly beautiful, it means that demand is still ongoing.
Our location has always been a blessing, and as well as it has been a curse.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. In Sri Lanka, plundering of cultural sites and stealing of archaeological objects has not only has increased over the years, but also well organized now, better organized actually, I should say. Unfortunately, some of the so-called custodians of cultural heritage seems to be linked to some of these racketeers of cultural heritage, looters. Even the well-guarded National Museum in Colombo got robbed recently. With your experience in other Asian countries like in Nepal, in other countries that you have worked recently, what can you recommend to minimize such crimes in Sri Lanka?
I think the key here is to involve every stakeholder. And so it's not just about dealers, it's not just about auctioneers, it's very much about the local communities who are the front line of working with, of worshipping this cultural heritage. Because they worship cultural heritage and deal with those cultural objects every day, they are also the best people to protect it, or to at least alert authorities when something gets stolen or taken away. In addition, of course, a lot of local communities, but also a lot of source countries internationally, have been denied access to these conversations that have happened on a larger level in terms of how to protect cultural heritage more effectively. And this is where we should really bring in those underrepresented voices. So it is working with all the stakeholders, including all departments of government, for example, of law enforcement, but also academia plays an essential role in creating an idea of what the media and what kind of networks are in place and why and how people do this, so that ultimately we can all protect heritage more efficiently. It's not just the task of government, it's not just a task of civil society. All stakeholders are responsible for protecting cultural heritage better.
Emily, now let me bring your attention to more controversial, perhaps, aspect of cultural property, and that is the dimension of so-called the artifacts taken during the colonial period, and some of these artifacts are held in European and North American museums. According to the Archaeological Institute of America, 85 to 90% of artifacts in museums in those countries do not have documented provenance, meaning their ownership or origin cannot be traced. Certainly, most of these artifacts are from Asia or from Africa. Some of the best items, such as the bronze statue of Thara of Sri Lankan origin, is in the British Museum, as you know. In 2018, the French government commission report revealed that around 90% of Africa's cultural heritage is held in Western museums. France has about 90,000 such objects. In 2021, President Emmanuel Macron returned some of the artifacts, around 26 of them, back to Kingdom of Benin. And this created a demand for returning unfairly collected cultural objects to where they originated from. Now, this is a very controversial thing, and what is your take on this demand now?
Again, I think we should listen to those nations of which the cultural heritage originated from. So this narrative should not be dominated by the colonizers, as it has been for so long, but instead we should listen to the colonized nations and what they will be doing with that cultural heritage. Again, if it's only about access or agency, that can be reinstated collaboratively, but the onus here is on those former colonizers to address the problematic histories of which these objects are a part of, and to proactively look towards solutions. Because although perhaps no laws were in place that make these objects illegal, their removal was certainly unethical. And so they should, if wanted, if countries want them back, they should of course be given back.
Also, Emily, I would like to bring your attention to this UN declaration on the right of indigenous people to claim such treasures. So there are such international conventions as well.
Absolutely. Now we're moving more towards seeing cultural objects and cultural expressions as a human right. The human right to make or own or destroy such cultural objects. And that cultural right should be recognized. So it's incredibly important for these former colonizing nations to address these past harms that they've caused, and also to recognize the ongoing harm that is going on because of the demand that is still driving the market. So, for example, not only harm on an individual level if someone loses their property or their cultural object, but also on a communal level, on a national level, and on an international level, because cultural objects are a finite, non-renewable resource. And so when they disappear from a community, the risk is also, of course, that intangible heritage attached to that cultural object disappears. The rituals, the stories, the oral traditions, the food, the music that is attached to that object could potentially also be lost. So much more harm is done by removing such an object for the sake of putting it on someone's mantelpiece or putting it with other Asian objects in a very sanitized museum place. So instead, former colonizers as well as other nations can ask themselves, okay, who is a museum really for? And what kind of objects do we want to represent that vision? And right now, we should definitely be guided by the archaeological rich countries of which these cultural objects are coming from, especially because cultural objects and the right to culture is a human right and is recognized as such.
And Emily, also I need to remind you that like we concentrated only on cultural heritage, and we did not talk about natural heritage.
Absolutely.
Which is also part of your research interest.
Yes.
Something that probably we will get to talk in a later day.
I hope so.
Yeah. Emily, thank you very much for your time and sharing your views with us. It has been wonderful to talk to you in this evening.
My pleasure.
I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we will have to conclude now with the hope that we will continue this discussion in future talk. Let me conclude citing two great individuals and their work. In his very influential book, Past is a Foreign Country, written in 1975, David Lowenthal illustrated how past influence to create personal and national identities. That means our cultural inheritance is deeply rooted in our past. That means our cultural inheritance is, as I said, is rooted in our past. Therefore, protection of cultural property is also protection of our own identity. Similarly, Professor Colin Renfrew of Cambridge University, who was my guru as well, said that the past is big business. We have been talking about it. It is a business in tourism and in auction rooms. Past is politically charged, ideologically powerful and significant. And past or remains of it is subjected to increase in destruction. What can we do about these problems? Well, we need to discuss about these issues and keep the general public informed and get all stakeholders holders involved to safeguard the cultural property as we have been discussed here. So goodbye until we meet up next time to continue this dialogue on heritage issues. Thank you very much, Emiling. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Dr. Bohingamua and Dr. Smith for that very insightful and interesting discussion on this very important topic. Thank you so much for tuning in to Spotlight. We'll do this all over again next week as well. Have yourself a pleasant day ahead.
In addition